program is about patient rights. After completing this lesson, you will be able to explain the role of policy and procedure in ensuring patient rights, explain two behaviors which maintain confidentiality of records, and describe two ways to include the patient in care planning.
The year was 1776. American colonists declared their independence from the British Crown. They were seeking acknowledgement of their innate rights and the freedom to live as they chose. The Declaration of Independence shows they understood that those who are in control derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Did they know how well all of this would apply to our contemporary healthcare system? Probably not. But they knew what they eventually wanted, and it's evident that they understood people and the process of change. It took 11 years to agree on a draft of the Constitution. Yet, magnificent as it is, it was incomplete. There still was no guarantee of personal rights. 4 years after that, on December 15, 1791, the Bill of Rights was signed. Finally, this crowning achievement guaranteed to the people that their basic rights would be respected, the core of what they had pursued for so long. From the beginning, this process has never been easy, always worthwhile, but never easy. And so it continues today. It's not difficult to see the parallels between the early Americans and patients in our healthcare system. Think back to your experiences years ago with doctors and hospitalizations. The doctor was very much in charge of the medical treatment for patients. He would diagnose and treat, seldom explaining anything to the patient or family. Physicians wrote the orders. Nurses carried them out. The patient was kept in the dark about the care, the prognosis, even what was wrong with him. The medical team believed it was best for the patient to not know about his condition. As long as he followed the medical plan, he would be all right. The patient was viewed as being ignorant about his care and condition and uninterested. The end result? The patient was an uninvolved, uninformed, and passive recipient of his own care. Thankfully, over the years, things began to change as healthcare providers realized that patients are not helpless and uninterested and should not accept care without questions. Patients have a right to participate and make choices about health care. That is one reason why so many people choose home health care. Now, it is common practice to get a second opinion, to ask questions, and to voice complaints if care is not perceived as satisfactory. But like the early Americans, patients realized that it would take more to ensure their participation than just their own willingness. Without any guarantees, healthcare providers did not have to listen to opinions or permit the patient to exercise his options. That's why we began to see a movement toward patients' rights in the 1970s. As the Bill of Rights to the Constitution guaranteed that the rights of citizens would be respected, a statement of rights for patients would ensure that they could exercise their rights within the healthcare system. In 1987, patient rights became an important focus of home health care. The Omnibus Reconciliation Act, also known as OBRA 87, revised the conditions of participation for home health agencies. The conditions of participation are a set of statements which apply to services provided to all patients in Medicare-certified home health agencies. Agencies must demonstrate compliance with these conditions in order to be reimbursed for services by Medicare. Among other things, OBRA 87 mandated that home health agencies must protect and promote the rights of their patients, just like the Bill of Rights does for citizens. The 6 standards contained in OBRA 87 detail the rights of the patient of a home health agency. The standards cover these areas: notice of rights, exercise of rights and respect for property and person, right to be informed and to participate in planning care and treatment, confidentiality of medical records, patient liability for payment, and the home health hotline. But you must remember one important fact which lies behind all of this. It is not enough to simply not violate the patient's rights. Instead, you must actively promote the rights of every patient. Promoting patients' rights means that you will go beyond simple compliance and actively work for and with your patients on their behalf. We'll look at each standard in greater detail as it pertains to care delivery and discuss ways that you can promote patient rights. It takes three essential and interrelated components of knowledge and practice to actively promote your patient's rights. You must know, understand, and apply agency policy and procedure. You must know about those factors and situations which make it difficult for a patient to exercise these rights. And you must recognize your role in care delivery and how your attitudes affect the care you provide. As we discuss these essential components, we'll study each of the 6 patients' rights standards. The wording of your agency's Statement of Rights may vary from the language in OBRA 87, but the principles remain the same. We'll look at a variety of care delivery scenarios to show you ways you can promote the rights of your patient every day. Let's begin with agency policies and procedures. Policies and procedures are quantitative and qualitative descriptions of agency responsibilities to the patient. That means policies and procedures spell out what you and other members of the home care team must do to provide quality care to the patient. Your agency has policies and procedures which govern what you wear, how you care for patients with specific conditions, how you will document and report information, and more. You must understand and apply these directions to care delivery. If you don't, your agency will not meet the standards of care it has set for its patients. Policies and procedures govern your actions as they apply to 4 of the 6 standards of patient rights. The first is the Notice of Rights. The home health care agency must provide the patient with a written notice of the patient's rights in advance of furnishing care to the patient or during the initial evaluation visit before the initiation of treatment. The agency must maintain documentation showing that it has complied with this regulation. Your agency's admission procedure explains how the patient is to be informed of his or her rights. This is usually done by a professional member of the team, most often the nurse, who admits the patient to services. During the admission process, the nurse presents a copy of the Statement of Rights to the patient and discusses each standard. Because every patient has different abilities and limitations, and physical, mental, and emotional status can vary widely, the nurse tries to explain those rights in a way that the patient will understand. After discussing her rights with the patient and answering any questions, the nurse will leave a copy with the patient. It's best to put this copy in a place where the patient can refer to it periodically, such as in the patient's folder or on the refrigerator. The patient will sign a form acknowledging receipt of the statement along with other admission documents, or may sign a duplicate copy of the rights statement. This signed document goes into the medical record at the agency. It is also a good idea for the nurse to note any comments in the admission paragraph regarding the patient's ability to understand the rights or how the patient responded to the discussion. The admission procedure must also give the patient information relating to the 6th OBRA 87 standard to inform the patient of the state's toll-free home health hotline. The patient has a right to be advised of the availability of the toll-free home health agency hotline in the state. When the agency accepts the patient for treatment or care, the agency must advise the patient in writing of the telephone number of the hotline established by the state, the hours of its operation, and that the purpose of the hotline is to receive complaints or questions about the local agencies. Your agency's statement of patient rights should include this information: the hotline number, its hours of operation, and that the purpose is to receive complaints or questions about home health agencies. The simplest way to inform the patient of this right is to explain the purpose and point out the number to the patient as part of the admission discussion. The next standard governed by agency policy is liability for payment. This one is a bit more complex. Let's look at the first part. The patient has the right to be advised orally and in writing before care is initiated of the extent to which payment for the agency's services may be expected from Medicare, Medicaid, or any other federally funded or aided payment program known to the agency. Charges for services that will not be covered by Medicare, and the charges that the individual may have to pay. When you enter the arena of Medicare and Medicaid services and charges, you get into a complicated area. That is why agencies have a service or financial agreement with detailed procedures for its use. On this agreement, the agency can detail charges and payments for its patients. This subject can be very complex and confusing, especially when the patient has more pressing concerns about illness and physical limitations to worry about. Taking into account the patient's ability to understand and retain information about payment, the nurse must make a reasonable attempt to help the patient understand the sources of payment and charges so that the patient can make informed decisions about care and treatment. The patient should sign a copy of the service agreement for the medical record and keep one for reference. The agency must also inform the patient of changes in this plan as they occur. The patient has the right to be advised orally and in writing of any changes in the information when they occur. The agency must advise the patient of these changes as soon as possible, but no later than 30 calendar days after the date that the agency becomes aware of the changes. Here is one situation. The doctor has discontinued skilled nursing services, but the patient will continue with physical therapy. The agency must inform the patient of these changes. It's a good idea for the agency to have the patient sign a revised service agreement if liability for payment changes. Your patient has decided that she needs assistance from a homemaker. The agency will present another service agreement noting the charges which the patient will pay for the homemaker. Policy and procedure are important to one more patient rights standard: confidentiality of medical records. The patient has the right to confidentiality of the clinical records maintained by the home health agency. The agency must advise the patient of the agency's policies and procedures regarding the disclosure of clinical records. Your agency has policies and procedures which describe the actions you must take to ensure that information in the clinical records remains confidential. Some policies pertain to the necessary information which must be kept in the home, such as the home health aid assignment. Keep this information in a special folder in a designated place and handle it carefully. Some agencies put a confidential sticker on the front of the folder. Inform the patient and any family members that this information is important for caregiving and should not become reading material for the neighborhood. If there are other people in the home during your visit, you may need to modify your actions to maintain confidentiality. When it's time to document, sit in a quiet corner, removed from the hustle of everyday activity. If you must make a phone call from the home to report significant information, be mindful of the tone of your voice and the information you relay. Carefully describe only the facts. The patient may be sensitive about the information. If at all possible, use a phone in a private room to lessen the chance that anyone might overhear your conversation. Also, be aware of your agency's policies for confidentiality of the records you must carry with you. Remember, that documentation is a legal record. Do not fold or stuff your documentation into your pocket or purse. Carry your notes in a folder or nurse's bag which you can close. Keep track of it. Whenever possible, take the documentation straight to the agency. Don't let notes sit around in your car or at your home. Follow agency policy for care and storage of the medical record in the agency office. Your agency also should have a way to inform the patient of its policies for disclosure of information in the record. Usually this disclosure information is a part of the admission information provided to patients. And you must maintain confidentiality in your discussion of patient care. You know that you cannot talk about your patient with your friends, family, or just anyone on the bus. Be aware of any conversation you have so that you are not overheard. Share information with other members of the healthcare team in a wise and careful manner in a place conducive to privacy, such as in the office. These conversations about your patients must be only for the purpose of planning, revising, and evaluating patient care. Avoid gossip. Be sure to discuss any concerns about the confidentiality of the record with your supervisor. There is one unwritten point in this patient right to confidentiality. Your patient has the right to privacy in treatment and care delivery. This right also extends to other areas as the patient chooses, such as telephone calls or time with visitors. Give the patient some private time, if at all possible. Let's review some important information about the 4 patient rights standards we discussed. What are the conditions of participation? How is the patient notified of his or her rights? What is the Home Health Agency hotline? What is the purpose of a service or financial agreement? What are 2 ways you can maintain confidentiality of the medical record? We've seen that policy and procedure are important. Now let's discuss the other 2 essential components of knowledge and practice. You must know about those factors and situations which make it difficult for a patient to exercise these rights. And you must recognize your role in care delivery and how your attitudes affect the care you provide. I have said many times that it's not enough that you do not violate the patient's rights. You must actively promote them. Why is this worth repeating? Isn't it the responsibility of the individual to take advantage of these rights? After all, it's not difficult to exercise your rights as a citizen. You go to the polls to vote, or find yourself a lawyer or a plumber if you need one. So why can't the patient take a little responsibility? It's not that easy for your patients. The effects of illness and disease can lessen an individual's sense of control over life. Without control, it's difficult for anyone to assert their rights. To understand this, let's look at what happens during illness. Loss of health is the first step to loss of control. Very often, the patient does not have the energy to meet basic needs, like getting out of bed, let alone participate in care planning for next week. Add to this the continuing drain on personal resources that these illness-related crises create, and you can begin to imagine what many patients are up against. Abrupt internal and external bodily changes, acute or chronic discomfort and pain, confrontation with the reality of one's own mortality, loss of abilities like ambulation, vision, and other senses, self-transportation, drain of personal financial resources, disruption in their daily lives, and confusion in roles of the family and patient. Every crisis further interferes with the patient's desire, willingness, and ability to participate in life. Family and friends, acting with the best of intentions, often exclude the patient from the usual role task and responsibilities. In their attempts to be kind and caring, family and friends start doing things for the patient to ease the burden. First, simple tasks like buying groceries or scheduling appointments. Because the patient is suffering from fatigue and the effects of illness, these initial efforts are welcomed. The caregivers, believing they know what is best for the patient, continue to do more, including those things that the patient could do. Before long, the sick person's role becomes one of total dependence. Besides coping with the effects of illness, many of your patients must also face the problems of aging. You've learned that as patients progress through the normal aging process, they may experience many losses: loss of job, income, and financial security, loss of friends, loss of hair, teeth, youthful appearance, loss of energy and desire to participate in activities, and more. Because of changes in bodily functioning or loss of memory, hearing, or vision, the older person may experience shame and diminished self-esteem, lose confidence, and feel less than adequate because he cannot do things as well as he did before. They let other people assume the responsibilities because it's just easier that way. And then we have the attitudes of caregivers about the elderly. In our society, old is synonymous with failure and incompetence. We tend to assign labels to the elderly which connote inferiority, such as helpless, senile, intolerant, demanding. We may even believe that they have no future, so we give up on their ability to be rehabilitated or even improve. And again, it is the caregiver who feels he or she must save the elderly patient. Combine the effects of illness and aging, and we can see why dependence occurs. Your patients may have lost faith in their abilities and capacity to change and relinquish all control and decision-making to others. However, we must realize that this does not have to be the case, because your patients are vulnerable. They need that extra effort from you to promote their rights. As a caregiver, you're in a position to make a genuine difference. You develop close ties with the patient and family and are there through the patient's most vulnerable moments. This is a very special, privileged position. Even though it may be easier to do the task and make decisions for the patient, we must actively promote our patient's function and independence. Here are some hints to help you. One of the first steps in being a promoter of patient rights is to take a good look at yourself. It's important to recognize your biases and try to control them. What are your attitudes toward patients? Do you think all elderly patients are senile? Perhaps you become impatient when the patient moves too slowly. Identify your strengths and weaknesses. Perhaps you're better at listening than talking. Maybe you feel uncomfortable working with depressed patients. Try to appreciate the problems and frustrations the patient experiences as a result of being sick. Remember, their symptoms are real. Seek to resolve conflicting attitudes regarding aging, death, and dependency so you can play a therapeutic role in the care of your patients. A chronic disease may slow a person, but it should not force him to rely totally on others. The elderly person can learn and make decisions if given the time and support. Then focus on the patient. The patient must receive messages of acceptability before inner strengths and confidence can flourish. You must promote self-esteem, an attitude of self-approval for your patient. Accept and respect the patient as an individual. The patient is a physical, psychological, social human being, much more than just a disease or illness. Demonstrate an appreciation of heritage, values, wisdom. Ask him about his life, what he did, who he is. Finally, make special efforts to reinstitute a sense of control for your patient. Restoration of self-control is basic to moving beyond the helplessness experienced with illness. The first step in regaining a sense of control is to encourage the patient to verbalize feelings. Listen to what's worrying the patient. From that information, you can begin to identify what the patient needs and what is important. Then, assist the patient to set realistic goals for participation in care that include the patient's abilities and desires. A routine is also important to the patient's sense of control. If the patient knows the schedule and what role to play, he'll feel more secure. The routine for care delivery should build on the patient's strengths. Modify the environment as needed to promote optimal functioning, and implement actions to conserve energy if your patient fatigues easily. During your work, tap into the patient's social support network. Family and friends are important, and you should all try to work as a team. And recognize your patient's efforts to control some aspects of his life. The patient may exert control over money, pictures, or the presence of family. Acts such as hoarding food, refusal of meals or medication, or ritualistic behavior can also be attempts at control. The patient may demand a time-specific routine or insist on the compulsive placement of personal articles, like putting his cane on the kitchen counter. When you see these actions, remember that your patient is trying to stay in charge, so respond accordingly. Don't yell at the patient who hoards food or medication. Rather, discuss this with your supervisor and find other ways for the patient to feel secure or exert influence. By understanding the patient, what is happening, your attitudes, your role, and some actions to take, you'll foster patient involvement and control. So now let's look at exercise of rights and respect for property and person. The patient has the right to exercise his or her rights as a patient of the agency. The patient's family or guardian may exercise the patient's rights when the patient has been judged incompetent. The patient has the right to have his or her property treated with respect. To treat property with respect means simply treating it as if it were your property. Be careful when handling it. Keep track of anything you work with and return it to the proper place. Don't borrow anything from the patient. The patient's property is one of the few remaining areas which the patient can govern. Where the patient positions her walker is a sign of her control. We must respect that and not move it without her consent. Do not rearrange furniture or personal items without your patient's permission. Implied in this standard is respect for the patient as a person. That is why we talked about your role as a caregiver, how your attitudes and perceptions influence your actions, and how you can assist your patient to more independence. To do that, you must treat the patient as a person whose opinions and ideas are important. Respect begins with something as simple as addressing the patient in a proper way. Ask how they would like to be addressed. Some patients may want you to address them as Mrs. or Mr. Others are more comfortable if you call them by their first name. In any case, avoid using familiar, condescending terms such as honey or dear. Respect also recognizes that each person is an individual with unique characteristics, personality traits, habits, cultural practices, and more. Whenever possible, personalize your care to address your patient's unique situation. This may mean that you'll have to prepare a special meal, such as a corn tortilla with enchilada sauce and refried beans. Respect for the person leads us to the next important requirement. The patient has the right to voice grievances regarding the care or treatment that is or fails to be furnished, or regarding the lack of respect for property by anyone who is furnishing services on behalf of the agency and must not be subjected to discrimination or reprisal for doing so. The agency must investigate complaints made by a patient or the patient's family or guardian regarding care that is or fails to be furnished, or regarding the lack of respect for the patient's property by anyone furnishing services on behalf of the agency, and must document both the existence of the complaint and the resolution of the complaint. The patient has a right to evaluate care and is ultimately the one to decide if care and services are satisfactory, not you or the doctor or the agency administrator. And that is why the patient has the right to complain about services. One of the best ways to treat complaints is to prevent them. Follow your assignment or care plan to deliver what the patient expects. Maintain open, mutual communication and show interest in what the patient has to say. Then the patient will probably not hesitate to speak out and let you know if something is not right. An open give-and-take discussion can resolve problems before they turn into complaints. Even if you have done the best you could, your patient may still file a complaint. In that case, the agency must investigate what has happened. The agency has policies and procedures which dictate how the agency will proceed in a complaint investigation. One of the important parts of the investigation will be talking to you and any other caregivers involved. Be sure that you relate all important observations and happenings in an honest and open fashion. And no matter what the outcome of the investigation, patient care must continue without any punishment or retaliation. The last standard of patient rights is the right to be informed and to participate in care planning. The patient has the right to be informed in advance of the care to be furnished and of any changes in the care to be furnished. The agency must advise the patient in advance of the disciplines that will furnish care and the frequency of the visits proposed to be furnished. The agency must advise the patient in advance of any changes in the plan of care before the change is made. The patient has the right to participate in the planning of the care. The agency must advise the patient in advance of the right to participate in planning the care or treatment and in planning changes in the care or treatment. Herein lies one of the most important patient rights. The involvement of the patient is essential if the care is to be successful. Members of the home care team must promote patient participation. Including the patient in the process gives him some degree of responsibility and accountability and encourages decision-making. There is a process that you can follow to do this. For the first step, members of the team must seek information to identify the patient's abilities, limitations, needs, and problems. There is the clinical information, diagnosis, prognosis, treatments, and other parts of care. And there is the situational information, patient values, views, beliefs, verbal, nonverbal communication skills, living arrangements, habits, personal choices, caregivers and their abilities, etc. It is also important to share information with the patient about your agency policies and procedures, especially schedules, services available, and emergency contacts. Informing your patient may prevent any misunderstandings at a later date. During the admission, the nurse learns that the patient has difficulty taking her medications. The nurse explains that she will set up the medications and teach the patient to do this, and that the home health aide cannot assist with medication setup. The patient and the team then work together to develop goals and a plan. Throughout the process of care planning, you must remember the principles of empathy and try to see things from the patient's perspective. Try to overcome any communication barriers using nonverbal communication if necessary. After developing the plan, all members of the home care team, as well as the patient and family, must understand their roles and implement the plan. And don't forget to check on the patient's response to care. Is the patient satisfied with what is happening? Could you explore alternative courses for better results? Your goal should always be to help the patient grow within existing limitations. Here are some other points which will promote patient participation in care planning. Simply ask the patient for his opinions or ideas. Listen to what he has to say and incorporate that into care delivery. Explain to the patient what you will be doing and his role. Knowledge will give him confidence. Let the patient, particularly the handicapped or disabled, set the pace in walking and talking to promote a feeling of control. Know when and when not to offer help. And try to promote patient involvement based on the patient's abilities. Patients with limited abilities need help to realistically incorporate their limitations and the degree of control they can assume into care delivery. If the patient is physically limited but able to direct care, let the patient take charge as is appropriate. This patient with multiple sclerosis is planning the meals that her caregiver will prepare. If the patient is limited in cognitive or mental functioning, provide the instructions and let the patient perform the care. Your challenge will always be to balance these two end results: meet the patient needs and promote and protect the patient rights. The care plan and assignment become important vehicles in this process. They provide structure and direction to care delivery. If the home care team has included the patient in the planning and care delivery process, the patient will be well informed and a true participant. Then it becomes your responsibility to follow the assignment and implement the plan. This standard also says that you must inform the patient of changes in the plan during care delivery, such as a change in the schedule of visits or a new treatment. Give correct, complete information and sufficient time to get used to the changes. Remember, the patient has the right to refuse medications, treatments, or some other aspect of care. Be sure that you follow agency policy about what to do when the patient refuses care. Before leaving this standard, we must address one other important issue. How do you prove that your patient participated in care planning? Documentation demonstrates compliance. Use the initial assessment to identify the patient's abilities and limitations, any knowledge deficits or concerns. Write goals from the patient's perspective to reflect their expectations for improvement. On the home health aid assignment, identify what tasks the patient will perform during personal care. And record any subjective patient comments in the visit notes to show continuing patient evaluation and involvement. This scenario shows how the patient, nurse, and aide work together. During the admission process, the nurse records the patient's concerns about handling diabetic emergencies. The team sets two goals. The patient will be able to describe emergency treatment and administer her own insulin. The nurse will teach the patient how to do this. The aide assignment notes that the patient can do her bath, and the aide will assist with foot care and meal planning. Throughout the process of care delivery, the nurse, home health aide, and patient communicate and work as a team, continuously evaluating the plan and its impact. Let's take a moment to review your knowledge about the last two standards. Can you describe two factors which contribute to patient dependence? What are two ways to help restore a sense of self-control to your patient? How can you demonstrate respect for the patient's property? What are three ways to promote patient participation in care planning? As citizens, we cherish the Bill of Rights to the Constitution. It guarantees our rights as citizens. For your patients, the standards of patient rights are just as important. Know and practice them every day. By doing that, you will be the critical difference between the helpless ill person and the patient who knows he is worthy of care and continues to make the most of life.